Coming up, Jim McElwain's comments raise suspicions, and a former Alabama quarterback angers his own fans. We'll talk about it all next on AT&T SEC Country Live. Hello everyone and welcome to AT&T's SEC Country Live. My name is Brandon Adams. This is the former Alabama All-American Mike Johnson. We'll talk about some games day on the field and a lot of drama off the field here as well, because in the SEC there is never a dull moment, and today is another example of that.
Yeah, it's Florida-Georgia week, but I think the bigger thing I'm taking away from today, maybe my favorite champion of life we've had all year. I can't wait till you guys see that.
On behalf of Georgia fans, let me also correct Mike Johnson, who Georgia fans will remind you it's Georgia-Florida week.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Florida-Georgia is a band, Georgia-Florida is a football game, as a lot of people will say on Twitter from time to time.
That's my bad.
Of course, the Florida fans feel differently, and that's when we'll go back and forth on that here over the course of the next few days. Speaking of your comments, we'll have a lot of those on our program today. Let me start, though, by reminding you that AT&T is a proud sponsor of SEC Country Live. AT&T, entertainment your way. Make the switch to AT&T Wireless and DirecTV. They'll keep you connected all season long. And speaking of AT&T, let's do our AT&T SEC Country Live 1st and 10 here. And you mentioned the Georgia-Florida game coming up on Saturday, and the action on the practice field for these two teams after a bye week on Saturday probably pales in comparison to the action in boardrooms and in conference rooms and everywhere else around the University of Florida here over the last couple of days, because what started out as kind of a minor issue is kind of mushroom clouded here as of late into something a whole lot bigger. Jim McElwain was talking on Monday during his weekly press conference about the preparations for Georgia, and in the midst of that, let it be known that he has seen some threats come his way, not just to him, but to his players and his own family. And, well, it was a pretty dire description that McElwain gave of the situation around the Florida program. If you missed it, let me let you hear some of what McElwain had to say.
You know, a pretty good kind of lesson for the way things are. You know, there's a lot of hate in this world and a lot of anger. And yet it's freedom to show it. And you know, the hard part is obviously when the threats against your own players, the death threats to your families, the ill will that's brought upon out there. And yet, you know, I think it's really one of those deals that really is a pretty good testament to what's going on out there nationally. There's a lot of angry people, and in this business, we're the ones that you take the shots at, and that's the way it is.
As you might imagine, that line from McElwain was greeted with a lot of shock from media members who wanted to find out some more from him about exactly what happened, including one reporter who asked McElwain this. Here's the question and McElwain's response.
By the level of the vitriol and...
No, I think it's, you know,
did you
here's
expect
the one thing. You're in the business. That's all part of it. You get it. It's when it's directed towards your players, when it's directed towards families, wives, you know, that kind of thing. And yet, at the same time, they know what they signed up for as well, and that's part of the business.
So, Mike, that's obviously very serious stuff that Jim McElwain talks about there, and the kind of thing that we would all agree is reprehensible, not just for Florida fans if it happened, but any fan base if it happened. But the reason why you have to add if to that sentence about whether it happened or not is because there's some reason, apparently today, for skepticism about what McElwain originally claimed. Let me show you a response to the McElwain claim from Florida Senior Associate Athletic Director Steve McLean. He's essentially the SID there at Florida, and this is a statement that's sort of reverberated around college football a little bit. McLean says the University Athletic Association takes the safety of our student athletes, coaches, staff, families very seriously. Our administration met with Coach McElwain this afternoon. He offered no additional details. It almost seems like McLean is leaving McElwain out to dry and to fend for himself on his claims that his family, he, and his players received death threats. Is this situation as weird to you as it is to me?
It's definitely weird. I think the statement by Steve McLean definitely makes it another level of weird. I think when you look at what Jim McElwain said, you can take it a couple of different ways. First of all, death threats can come in a million different ways. You could have got a Facebook message. Somebody could have yelled at your family in the stadium and said, man, I hope he dies. Or, you know, there's so many different ways for that to be delivered that I don't think that he was making it up by any means. I don't think he just fabricated death threats against players or against his family and just all of a sudden decided to bring that up in a press conference. Now, what is Jim McElwain hiding? Is it somebody he knows that probably said this, or is he trying to hide fan base from this, or is he trying to say, you know what, there's nothing good that can come from this, let's bury it? I think the statement by McLean actually opens it up to say, what is he talking about, actually?
Yeah.
Maybe McElwain was a little bit more mad than a lot of people would lead to believe.
Well, here's one of and McElwain's obviously going to speak on behalf of his bosses, whether it be Scott Strickland, the athletic director, university president, or whomever. And here's a reason, obviously I can't put myself in the mind of Florida administrators, but here's a reason why the Florida officials could potentially be mad at McElwain over his original claim. This is the kind of thing McElwain's statement, whether true or not, becomes immediate fodder for negative recruiting. That's negative recruiting that'll last at Florida a lot longer than Jim McElwain's coaching tenure there, whether it be another year, another 5 years, another 10 years. All of a sudden now opposing coaches in the SEC can say, hey, Florida's a place that if you go play there, when things go bad, their fans are going to threaten to kill you. Jim McElwain said that himself, and he's the Florida coach. So one way or another, McElwain did not help the cause at Florida by saying what he said, and I would suggest that is a reason why maybe the Florida statement was a little bit stiff.
Well, I think another way of looking at this, too, is when you talk to people on Twitter and you read Twitter and the stories in the comment section, a lot of people think that this is being seen from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, does Florida have a reason now to fire Jim McElwain without show cause? I mean, can they just fire him and get out of his buyout because maybe he said something that's not true about the university or about their fan base? Are you looking at it from that angle? Also, is Jim McElwain trying to leverage things? Maybe get out of his contract, maybe head somewhere else. People don't look at him and say, maybe this is the bigger story this week. Maybe this is one he wants people to think of instead of the game against Georgia this weekend because, he thinks maybe there's a good chance to lose. I don't see it like that. I think Jim McElwain said what he said. I think he thought about it mid-sentence and thought, this is not going to make anybody look good. It's not going to make our team look good or my family look good or my coaches look good. So let me withdraw this. Let me take it back a little bit. Let me walk back my statement because I'm not sure I'm ready for all of this to go public and it makes us look terrible.
Haru Utsa says he also most likely lied about the interest in the Oregon State job as well. Maybe that was his agent that did that. That's what Haru weighs in on. Tony Conticello says McElwain needs to come clean. If there were threats, he's not telling the university and those who were threatened. And I guess there's a sense that that's true, that if there were real threats and McElwain's not going to his superiors on them, then he's actually leaving the people in his charge in danger.
Well, like I said, there's a couple of different ways for that threat to have been carried out. I mean, is somebody just yelling at you on the street? Is somebody yelling at your family? Is somebody saying these things on a message board? Or did somebody send you a letter with the letters from a magazine cut out and pasted on a piece of paper that's getting delivered to your house? I mean, how serious are these threats? And I think let's not forget what we saw from Texas A&M early in the year. These threats do happen. These happen to coaches. These happen to players. You do get threatened in jobs like this when there's so much emotion on the line, especially leading into a game against Georgia on Saturday. So I definitely think that it probably happened. I'm just not sure at what point that you bring it up and make it a big deal.
We're going to have more on this in the show a little later on, but let me take it back to the game here for a moment against Georgia. Whether it be, the trash talk from the Florida players this week, which we'll also talk about some more in a moment, or what McElwain's saying here, the 3-3 record, turmoil around the Florida program, does it make it more difficult to focus in on this game on Saturday?
I don't think it does if you're the players. I think that Jim McElwain, probably the reason he regrets the statement, probably the reason he walked it back and didn't add any additional details is because this is all about the game this week. That's always been my impression of Jim McElwain. I think that's probably what's going through his head right now. I think that these guys are so locked in. It's a rivalry game. You're going to Jacksonville to play Georgia, the number 3 team in the country. You have a chance to really salvage your season. I think they're locked in on doing what they need to do to be able to be successful this weekend, not on what's going on with their head coach and with the SID.
Keep your comments coming. We'll run through them today here on AT&T SEC Country Live. Obviously, this is a volatile subject that a lot of Florida fans weighing in on, and folks outside Gator Nation also weighing in on as well. Let me move on for now, though, to item number 2 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. And this is a complicated subject that I also think you and I are both going to have a lot to say about, but for a very different reason. This obviously mostly on the football field here. But Greg McElroy, the former Alabama quarterback, made an appearance on a sports radio station WJOX in Birmingham, Alabama this week, making a case about the Alabama schedule maybe not being as strong as some Tide fans think that it is, or hope that the committee views it as being when the first college football playoff top 25 comes out next Tuesday. McElroy then went on his own radio show, the Sirius XM satellite radio show, ESPNU Radio, and kind of further explain his problems with the Alabama schedule and why he thinks that when the committee gives out its first ranking next week, Alabama might not be number 1. Believe it or not, it's Tide fans who may be the most bothered by what the Alabama quarterback has to say here. Take a listen from ESPNU Radio.
Yeah, I would be surprised, actually, if Penn State wins this weekend if they didn't get jumped to number 1. Alabama's not a foregone conclusion to be 1 because they haven't really played anybody. And their fans lost it on me yesterday because I said that. People are just unrealistic. Oh, well, we beat Florida State. They're 2-4. Alabama hadn't beaten anybody. Their best win is against A&M, and that was an 8-point marginal victory. But we've beaten everybody else bad. Okay, but that doesn't matter. They're not any good.
Yeah, so listen, in this particular instance, I think that McElroy comes across like a dope and a jerk. It almost sounds like he's trolling his own fans here. And we can have a debate on the merit of who has Alabama played and is this a schedule that warrants being the #1 team in the country, and that's fine. We can do that. But on just the tone in which McElroy delivered that on ESPNU radio and similar remarks on the sports radio station WJOX, which is right there in Birmingham, the heart of Alabama Nation and the group of people that made McElroy famous in the first place, the fact that he would essentially sort of rub it in their face and say, I don't think you've played anybody, I don't think you ought to be #1 when the poll comes out. And yeah, he's going to parse his words and mince his statements so that he can later say, hey, I didn't say anything bad about Alabama. I still think they ought to be the #1 team. That's fine, but there's a way to deliver things, and McElroy, the Alabama alumnus right there, sounds a little too harsh for me in regards to his own fan base.
Yeah, the blowback's been pretty huge from the people I've talked to in and around the Alabama fan base. That, listen, I tend to kind of almost agree with what Greg McElroy said. You know how I feel about the college football playoff. If you're in the top 4, who cares where you're ranked?
Right.
To me, I mean, if you're #1, #2, and Penn State beats Ohio State and Michigan State in back-to-back weeks, fine. But, put Penn State #1. But it is the way that Greg McElroy comes across. I almost feel like he should take a page and maybe meet with like Kirk Herbstreit about the way he's conducted himself to Ohio State fans, because he does catch a lot of flack from Ohio State fans. And Greg's the same way when it comes to Alabama. And somehow he just it's like it's the way he terms it. He's like, they're fans. He keeps talking about Alabama fans saying they're fans. these fans, they're fans. Yeah. They always want to tweet at me and comment at me. That's not the way you approach it. These fans, Greg, that you're talking about have made you what you are.
Right.
I mean, let's not forget that this is, you didn't make a huge splash in the NFL. You played 2 years under Nick Saban and won a national championship. These fans are the people you should be thinking, not saying these fans are their fans. I think it's a bad look. And you mentioned it. He comes off in just a bad light right here. I like Greg. Just comes off in a bad light when he talks about topics.
Well, you make the comparison to Kirk Herbstreit, who a lot of our audience was aware, played at Ohio State, and in his broadcast career, like a lot of broadcasters will, has almost seemed to kind of go out of his way to sort of prove his own objectivity. What a lot of people may not realize is he actually left Columbus, Ohio, doesn't live there anymore, lives in Nashville now. And what I think you see as the example from Herbstreit, who frankly I think a lot of times comes across as a less than happy person, he's blocked like 9 million people on Twitter. There are 100 people watching us right now that have been blocked by Kirk Herbstreit on Twitter. What it sort of shows me, I believe, is that this pursuit for like constant, like perfect objectivity is a waste of time.
It is.
I mean, on this show, everybody knows you played at Alabama.
Right.
You make no bones about that.
Right.
I'm dressed in red and black right now, but I never hear any grief from the Florida people. I let them know right away where I'm kind of coming from. Hey, I do Dog Nation Daily. I follow the Georgia program all my whole life, and we just sort of move on and deal with it. Same thing with you when it comes to the Alabama thing against Auburn or Tennessee. This notion that we expect objectivity from McElroy, we're not talking about politics or war here. We're talking about college football. It's supposed to be entertainment.
Well, and I think it's a problem that he expects it from himself. I mean, Greg, just embrace where you came from. And it's like every year that he's been a part of SEC Network, we've dealt with something like this from Greg McElroy. And the Alabama fan base, I think, is just at a point where they feel like he's actually turned against him. He almost sounds a lot like Danny Cannell in the way he comes off on some of his takes. It's like an anti-Alabama kind of thing. A couple of years ago, he talked bad about Blake Sims, the quarterback at Alabama, how he didn't develop as a passer, how he wasn't good enough to lead them to a national title. He's talked a little bit about Alabama fans and how they haven't had degrees from the university and how most of them didn't go to Alabama. It's a bad track. I just don't understand what his end game is here, and if he thinks he's just going to be beloved by everybody without having the reasons to.
Clint Cunningham says McElroy should be grateful for playing in Alabama and show some respect. I mean, I do think that the respect is not the wrong word to use here. I think having some respect for a fan base that has made you kind of what you are, at least a little deference to them on television, is not the world's worst idea, or the radio in this case.
I don't have a problem with it. I understand. This is why I love this show, is because you and I can be objective, and everybody knows our personal opinions about Bama and Georgia. But I don't think Bama's invincible. You don't think Georgia's invincible. We can talk about football with everybody in the comment section. It's like Greg goes out of his way sometimes to be the opposite of that.
Kelly Shadone says McElroy just pressing to appear like a homer. I've got no problem with what he said. So interesting take from Kelly there on the other side of things. Real quick on the substance of what he said, though. I think Alabama, in beating every team that it's played convincingly, is making its own case. Yes, they haven't played Ohio State and Penn State and Georgia every week so far this season, but if the biggest drawback you can have on them is they only won by like 8 or 9 points at Texas A&M, then they're handling their schedule just fine. And the people in the comment section know I'm by no means an Alabama homer, but I'm at least even going to say that.
Well, and here's the thing. I hate when you hindsight schedules. How many times have we talked about this? You can look back at the schedule and say, oh, well, it's not a good schedule. Well, guess what? When they made that schedule, when they scheduled that game with Florida State 3 years ago, Florida State was the defending national championship from 2013. So it's not like, hey, we did this on purpose. You've got your SEC schedule. You had your great non-conference game. You're going to play teams like Colorado State and Fresno State, just the nature of the beast in college football right now. But don't hindsight me. Don't get to week 8 and week 9 and say, you know what, that's a weak schedule. Because when the season started, it looked like a very tough schedule. You still have to play at a top 10 team in Auburn possibly, and you're still going to play an SEC championship game. I'm okay with the fact that if Alabama comes out number 1 and number 2 come October 31st, but I don't see why looking at the schedule and saying it's weak right now. I don't see what point that proves.
Steve Stevens says he's not lying. Penn State will be ranked number 1 if they beat Ohio State on Saturday.
That
may be the case. Let's also, as you pointed out yesterday, let's remember how these Big Ten teams have fared in the playoff as of late. All right, item number 3 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. So for now, it looks like Tennessee coach Butch Jones has a chance to save his job. That's what Mike Griffith wrote at SECCountry.com this week. And yet that has not stopped the swirling of rumors about who eventually might be the high-profile replacement for Jones when he eventually does get fired, and I think eventually that will happen. You had Paul Feinbaum on his radio show this week float the idea of Dan Mullen, the Mississippi State coach, as a replacement for Jones. You had the betting markets kind of reacting to the John Gruden rumors as of late. You've seen a big uptick in bets and line movement on Gruden as the favorite to get the Tennessee job. Those are 2 pretty big names. Mullen, a sitting SEC coach. Gruden, a one-time Super Bowl winning coach, and now I guess a high-profile broadcaster on Monday Night Football. Are either of those 2 names in your mind the top replacement for Butch Jones?
Here's why I don't think it's John Gruden, and I've kind of weighed back and forth on this a couple of times because I think this is a lot of Tennessee people's fan favorite to get the job. But I think that if it was John Gruden that they really had in their crosshairs, why isn't Butch Jones fired right now? John Gruden doesn't have a job right now other than hosting Monday Night Football for ESPN. If you're going to bring in a guy like that who is not coaching right now, then fire Butch Jones right now. Allow John Gruden to start recruiting these guys that are going to be in this next recruiting class. If they are trying to go after Dan Mullen or Chris Peterson or Bob Petrino or anybody else that's coaching right now, then it makes a lot more sense to me that Butch Jones has not been fired, because maybe you are waiting till the end of the year till one of these guys is done with their season and all of a sudden you can put him in place. I don't know. I don't see Gruden doing it. Dan Mullen, to me, I don't know if Tennessee's a lateral move or not. I mean, that's not a huge step up from Mississippi State. So I think they have to be careful with the move they make next.
Tony Pearson brings up a good point. If you're looking for an interim coach, you've got a guy, Brady Hogue, who's the defensive line coach, who was the head coach at Michigan. Now, obviously, that didn't work out very well for Hogue, but he's been a head coach before. So you've got a guy that can be your interim coach. And I told you this last, I guess it was yesterday, I would have fired Jones right after the Alabama game. I don't want to give him a chance to save his job, because winning out against the schedule that Tennessee plays the rest of the way, Kentucky this week, Vanderbilt, you got LSU looming there. There's not really any games on that schedule that makes me as a Tennessee fan, if I were one, feel good about Jones coming back.
Well, you can't feel good about him coming back, and I think it's going to happen that he's going to be fired. I think right now Curry up there as the AD is just kind of biding his time until he makes the move. I think he wants to make the move look good. I think you have to have another coach that you already have in the crosshairs when you fire Butch Jones, because like we've always been talking about this entire summer, this new signing period makes things a little bit more difficult. And so I think that you have to be careful when you fire Butch Jones. I'm with you. I don't know if Butch Jones would have gotten back on the plane or left the airport in Knoxville without having been fired this past weekend, but maybe John Curry has a plan. Maybe there's somebody waiting in the wings, or he's already been in contact with somebody that he says, you know what, maybe this will be an easy transition if I go there right now.
Bobby Brake also brings up another name in the comments section. What about the idea of Tennessee going after Chip Kelly? That's another big name potentially in this mix, in this mold. Also a guy that we don't quite know how it would fit in the SEC. Do you see Kelly at Tennessee as a potential fit?
I don't know that I see it as a fit. I think it would be a good hire. If Tennessee's able to bring in Chip Kelly, I would applaud that hire. I think that, like I've said all along, you hire proven Power 5 coaches at some of these roles, and I think the SEC will start getting back to the level it can be. I think Chip Kelly's going to take a lot of money. I think he's going to have to adapt the way he coaches to SEC defenses and SEC offenses, but I think it would be a home run hire. But I go back to what I said earlier. If you're going to go after Chip Kelly and you're already in touch with Chip Kelly, well, why is Butch Jones still the head coach? You know, that's a guy who doesn't have a job right now. So go out and go ahead and hire the guy.
That's a really good point.
Get him in place midway through the season and start recruiting this next class.
That's a really good point. All right, that's Mike Johnson. My name is Brandon Adams. This is AT&T SEC Country Live. AT&T, a proud sponsor of SEC Country Live. AT&T, entertainment your way. Make the switch to AT&T Wireless and DirecTV. They'll keep you connected all season long. Let's move on now. Let's talk about the Auburn Tigers, right up number 4 of our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. And I thought that Pat Forty at Yahoo Sports had a pretty interesting look at the Auburn Tigers this week, who after another, won against Arkansas on Saturday, but had a disappointing loss to LSU the week before. All of a sudden, it's sort of hard to figure out where Auburn is in this discussion. Maybe out of it in a lot of their fans' mind, but maybe still hanging on by a thread in the mind of others. And that's what Forty wrote about at Yahoo Sports this week. I'm going to show you a snippet of what he said, and it sets us up to have a discussion here. They're the only remaining team, he says, that play both Georgia and Alabama, and they play them both at home. If Auburn beats them both, wins out in the regular season, they'd actually go to the SEC title game. A win there to finish 11-2, including the high-profile wins, would give the committee a lot to think about. That's Pat Forty there from Yahoo Sports in terms of what Auburn might be able to do. I don't know if that's a possibility for a team that couldn't beat LSU last week, but what if Auburn were to win even just one of those games? Yeah. Doesn't get you winning the SEC West, falling below the threshold that I actually predicted Auburn to do earlier in the season, but a rivalry win against either Georgia or Alabama, would that be enough to satisfy what I would describe as a pretty restless bunch of Auburn fans?
I think it should. I think if you can knock off one of those teams that Auburn fans, for the most part, will be pretty happy at finishing the season 9-3. I know that you look at Gus Malzahn, and I've kind of been in that anti-Gus Malzahn train where I look at them and I say, what excuses do you have to lose in some of these games? Well, the way it comes down is Gus Malzahn, if they've been able to run the football this year consistently in the second half, they've won football games. If they have not, if they can't run with Kerryon Johnson and Cam Petway in the second half, Clemson, LSU, then they haven't been able to win. I think it's going to be a tough uphill task to run the ball against Georgia or Alabama. So I think that if you pull off one of those wins, it will make Gus Malzahn look a lot better. I know the game plan will probably be different by the time he gets there, but I think if you can pull off one of those games, it makes Gus Malzahn look a ton better to the fan base. The whole thing about pulling off two of them, I think, is incredibly tough. Not only that, but then you'd have to also beat Georgia probably a second time in Atlanta if you're going to have college football playoff chances.
Listen, I was high on Auburn at the beginning of the season, so I'm going to sound like a hypocrite for what I'm about to say, but I really haven't seen a lot from Auburn in the games that have mattered most that lead me to believe that they're capable of kind of going out and doing that. You can make case the Mississippi State game for Auburn is some proof of that, because Mississippi State's probably a pretty good team, and Auburn handled that version of the Bulldogs pretty easy. But extrapolating from that game, 2 wins, or even a big win against a Georgia or an Alabama, it does take a little bit of a leap of the imagination to kind of get there.
Well, it definitely is. And here's what's scary about it. I think Auburn definitely has the skill set to get it done. When you look at the quarterback position, the offensive line, the running back, I mean, they have the skill set to get it done. Kevin Steele's defense, but it's like at times you just don't see him. And listen, I thought that Gus Malzahn was extremely candid when he came out after the game against LSU and said, you know what? We pulled back. We didn't go at it like we should have in the second half because I thought we could handle the game with our running game, and it turns out you couldn't.
Yeah.
LSU's DBs blanketed Auburn in the second half because there was no kind of ability to run outside the tackles or throw any wrinkles in the offense from Gus Malzahn and Chip Lindsey. So that's what makes it tough for me to look at the Georgia game or the Alabama game right now on paper and say, man, you know what? Auburn could knock off both these teams. I don't think it'll happen. He could knock off one or the other, but if you're going to beat both those teams, then I think that Gus Malzahn should be more on the hot seat than he was to begin with, because if you can beat Georgia and Alabama at the end of the year,
what you doing in September?
What were you doing against LSU earlier in the year?
So here's the thing. I don't want to sound like I'm giving out participation trophies here, because I know what the name of the game is in the SEC. It's about winning championships. But if Auburn goes 9-3 and gets a rivalry win against either Alabama or Georgia, you got to call that a good season, right?
Yeah, I think so.
It's kind of in between what I predicted them to do, which was win the West, and what other people predicted them to do, which is lose 5 games. But 9-3, there ought to be no hot seat talk for Gus Malzahn at 9-3 with a rivalry win in November. Do you agree with me on that?
I completely agree with you. As a matter of fact, you know, we've had this topic kicked around, and we'll probably discuss it in the coming weeks. That Paul Feinbaum said he wouldn't be shocked if Gus Malzahn winds up at Arkansas maybe after the year. Maybe he jets from Auburn and winds up at a place like Arkansas. That'd be a home run hire for me for Arkansas, because I think Gus Malzahn is a good coach. Yes, you have some of the back and forth. He's lost some of the big games. Has not been good recently against his rivals, but he has the ability, and he's shown the ability to beat just about anybody when it comes to college football. So I've ragged on Gus Malzahn, and I've said I don't think he can win the West, and he's shown an inability right now to beat LSU and Clemson early in this year. But he still is a good coach. I mean, he is a good coach, and if you can knock off one of those teams, 9-3 to me looks like a great season.
Let me knock out a few of these comments here. Clint Cunningham says Auburn seems to always fall short of people's expectations. They never finish. It certainly seems like that's been true a lot lately, and kind of one of those weird things where Auburn's good when you think they're going to be bad when you think they're going to be good. But is part of Auburn's inability to live up to expectations built around the fact that for a program that's so desperate to chase down Alabama, the expectations have just been too high?
Possibly. And I think that comes around with a lot of things you've seen in the SEC recently. I mean, Les Miles gets fired, Mark Richt gets filed. Gus Malzahn's been on the hot seat. It's just that if you're not winning 10 games, it's almost not good enough. With the expanded 12-game play, thing, and then all of a sudden teams are playing 15 games to win a national title. you have to get to that 10-win plateau. And I think if you in the regular season and you're 9-3, for a place like Auburn that expects to be in the national title picture, it's just not good enough.
James Crump says Auburn doesn't have the quarterback to beat Alabama or Georgia. And listen, you know I was high on Stidham coming into the year. What I saw from him in the fourth quarter of LSU makes me think that James got a pretty good point, that right now Stidham doesn't look capable of winning one of those kind of games. I'm going to say that for me, though, the Auburn offensive struggles have been more about whatever's going on in the power struggle between Chip Lindsey, the play caller, Gus Malzahn, the head coach. I think Stidham in the right hands could be a good quarterback. I'm just not so sure the Malzahn-Lindsey combination is really working there.
I'm completely on board with you, and I've talked about it. I talked about it after the Clemson game and talked about it after the LSU game. Offensively, I don't know what the scheme is. They're throwing Jarrett Stidham out on an island right now at times when they shouldn't be. He should be leaning on the running game. And it's like, hey, we're going to run the ball right up the middle, and then if we don't get in our schedule, if it's not 3rd down and 2, then Jarrett Stidham's going to throw the ball 40 yards downfield. I think what you saw when they played Arkansas this past weekend was Jarrett Stidham still doing the same things, but throwing some of the back shoulder catches, using the screen game a little bit, throwing to the running backs in the flat, but the downfield passing game was the same way for me. I still have so many questions about what they're doing.
Chris Kelly says Auburn's got the D to beat Georgia, but not Alabama. Chris, I understand where you're coming from on that for right now, but don't be so sure that when the end of November gets here, that Georgia D, the offense, doesn't look pretty similar to what Alabama's doing offensively.
Well,
right
yeah, and I think you look at that schematically, and you see Fromm as a pro-style passer, and you see Auburn's ability to shut down the run game, and I think that's an easy comparison to make. As opposed to Jalen Hurts and running the ball and racking up, already I think 600 yards on the year in terms of rushing offense. So I think you definitely are going to have two different styles. It's going to be up to Auburn to kind of adapt things with Kevin Steele. But Kevin Steele's seen it all. He has shown the ability to beat either one of these offenses. So I don't think either one of them is a slam dunk.
Robbie Strong asked a great question. What if LSU wins out? Lost to Troy, but a team that's getting hot right now with Alabama looming in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Is that still a team that's in the conversation? If it were to be SEC champions, can you go to the playoff if you got a loss to Troy on your resume?
I think it would definitely be intriguing. I think that if that happened, LSU would be, the team that keeps SEC out of the playoff. But I'm not saying it can't happen because I have seen an LSU team that is what I thought they were when they started the year. I thought that LSU would be second in the SEC West. I thought they would come in right below Alabama because they had Arden Key, because they had Darius Geis, because I expected big things with Danny Etling coming back under Matt Canada. Well, we didn't see that in the first 3 or 4 weeks. Now you're starting to see it. Arden Key with a couple of sacks. Darius Geis with 270 yards rushing. They look like a very dangerous team to me.
All right, let me move on to item number 5 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 listen. You may not think this is as funny as I do. I actually thought this was pretty fun. So Tennessee's playing Kentucky on Saturday, and we know how embattled Butch Jones is. Well, one of his colleagues in the league, his opponent for this Saturday, decides to come to his defense in his weekly press conference. I'm talking about Kentucky coach Mark Stoops. We'll show you the graphic on the screen because I want you to be able to see the words here. Stoops says, "We know what Tennessee can do. I know the way people pile on people when they're not doing so well. I know how it goes. I've been there." There's an element of what Stoops says there that sort of sounds like, hey, I've been in that spot before. I know what it's like to be a coach in the hot seat. Thank goodness that's over with. And I want to say back to Stoops, aren't you kind of still there? This idea that from a job security standpoint, you're some different zip code than where Jones is right now. I'd say that for Stoops, you're kind of still there right now, aren't you?
No, I don't think so. I don't think. I think when you look,
he just got blown out by Mississippi State.
He's 5-2, and he's a 6-point favorite against Tennessee, who has beaten him 31 of the last 32 years. I think that says all you need to know about Butch Jones. I also think it says all you need to know about Mark Stoops.
Wait, how big of a favorite are they?
5.5 to 6 points right now.
Lord, Tennessee, what is wrong?
That's what I'm saying.
Y'all?
That's my exact point. Is like Mark Stoops. I think he's feeling pretty good. He sees that line, knows what he has in his team. Yes, they lost 2 games, and yes, they lost to Mississippi State on the road last weekend, but I think Kentucky fans seem pretty content with what's going on in the head coaching position when you look at Tennessee right now.
We'll get back to this topic in a moment. We got to have a quick intervention. Tennessee, how are you going to be a touchdown underdog to Kentucky?
I know.
That is not acceptable.
That's what I said that last week when I said, you're a 37-point underdog to Alabama. That alone probably gets Butch Jones fired, and now you're a touchdown underdog to Kentucky, who, like I said, beaten you one time in the last 32 years.
People agree with you, by the way. Let me hit a few of these comments. People are agreeing with what you're saying. Brian Russell says Kentucky is okay where they are. Stephen Shaw says Kentucky's going to finish 9-3 this year. We're seeing some Go Big Blues coming in the comment section as well. So people apparently agree with you.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that. I mean, this is a team that's a couple of blown assignments in the secondary away from beating Florida, and they'd be 6-1 sitting right there. I mean, Mark Stoops would be. I mean, this guy would be crowned king of Kentucky.
But hold on. This is not the whole story either. I mean, I couldn't find Snapchat if you gave me 6 months, but you've got a lot of social media stuff going on between Kentucky players here as well. Let me read this really quick, and then I want to show you a tweet. You've got some Kentucky player that goes on Snapchat that says, "I feel like if we just threw the rock, we would be unblank unstoppable." That's what a Kentucky player said with Steven Johnson sitting right next to him on a Snapchat video the other day. You got Denzel Ware, a Kentucky linebacker. I'll show you this tweet. He's tweeting at some radio host, a former Kentucky player, said, just had a bag of Frito-Lays. He says this to the Kentucky broadcaster, them things was trash just like you. That's what a current Kentucky player said on Twitter this weekend about a former Kentucky player who's doing a radio show there in Lexington. So let's not act like everything is all peachy keen in Lexington at the moment.
I know that looks bad on the outside, but I mean, think about you people in the comment section. Think about where you work and think about going in your workplace. And you always have a couple of people that you're like that guy over there is a little bit dumb. You know what I'm saying? That's a locker room. You're going to have those people that are a little bit askew from the norm when you walk in the locker room. Those people are obviously unleashed on Twitter. I don't think that's a bad sign for the head coach, though. Do you?
I prefer, if I'm the head coach, I'd prefer you not do it.
Well, absolutely. I'm sure he got a talking to after it was done, but I don't think that makes Mark Stoops look any worse than he does.
By the way, that's Max Godby, the former Kentucky player who Ware's going after on Twitter. And as far as your own problems at workplace, yeah, we get into squabbles here at SEC Country Live, presented by AT&T, every single day. But it's not like I go tweeting about people.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying there's 130 people on that team. One guy tweeting to a former player is not a bad thing, in my opinion.
Final point from this subject, because we've talked about Kentucky way too long. If this is what counts as a stable situation in the SEC, then the SEC's got a lot of problems.
Well,
if you're going
that's fair to say.
If you're going to give me Stoops as a stable SEC coach with his players bashing the play calling on Snapchat and criticizing former players on Twitter, then that's a bad look for the SEC.
Well, I think you and I have been kind of blinded to it this year because Georgia and Alabama right now are undefeated, and that's probably the only. I mean, honestly, outside of Alabama and Georgia right now, what other stable situation do you see? I mean, we talked about Kevin Sumlin getting death threats, Jim McElwain getting death threats. We've been talking about his players being outspoken. Arkansas, Lord knows what they are. Missouri the same way. Tennessee needs to fire their. I mean, that's the nature of the beast right now as far as this conference goes. Am I wrong? I mean,
so maybe Stoops was right when he says I've been there. Maybe this is what it looks like.
I would say Kentucky is the third most stable situation in the SEC. I really would. I mean, Ed Orgeron, LSU's getting good, but I mean, come on, man. I think that's fine right now.
This is a crazy league if that's the case, but you're probably right. We'll take more of your comments about it. That's Mike Johnson. I'm Brandon Adams. It's AT&T SEC Country Live. AT&T, a proud sponsor of SEC Country Live. AT&T, entertainment your way. Make the switch to AT&T Wireless and DirecTV. They'll keep you connected all season long. I want to transition here, talk about the Georgia-Florida game on Saturday. I want to find this quote from Greg Steele, who reminds me, Florida's an extra point and a one punt coverage away from being undefeated in the SEC, BA. That's true, but I guess if Tennessee and Kentucky had a defense on the field, maybe they'd have lost both those games. So you can kind of swing back and forth about that. But nonetheless, we'll move on to item number 6 on our AT&T SEC Country Live 1st and 10. And no doubt, Greg in the comments section was loving what he saw from Florida defender Chauncey Gardner this week, who during his social media, or I should say media availability, let it be known that he's not too sure about what's going on with Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. We showed you this yesterday from our colleague Jordan McPherson. The quote from Gardner, he's throwing simple slant passes. I get it. Anybody can throw a slant, hashtag Gators. That's the quote from Chauncey Gardner as captured by Jordan McPherson from SECCountry.com. So what is the issue here for Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm? Is he doing simple passes, handling a small load of the Georgia offense? Is he ready for his first game against Florida in Jacksonville on Saturday, a place the Dogs have not had a lot of success as of late? Well, Kirby Smart was asked about that on Monday, and here's what Smart said about Fromm.
I think anytime you've got a true freshman starting, it's challenging. I think this kid's grown. He's gotten better each week. I hope that continues through the bye week. I mean, but you referenced Jacksonville. I think what makes it challenging is the Florida defense that happens to be in Jacksonville. It's not just the fact we're playing in Jacksonville, it's that we're playing against a caliber of defense that has been really, over the last 10 years, they've been, one of the best defenses in the country. So you look at what they've done, the players they've had, the style of defense they play, they're attacking, they're aggressive. I think Coach Randy Shannon does a great job with them.
So that's Kirby Smart talking about Jake Fromm there in the comment section. Jamie Bailey, a Georgia fan, also weighing in on Fromm, saying he's made all the big throws every time he's been asked to. And I don't think that's debatable. Objectively true to this point, that Fromm, I think, has had a good freshman season and come up big when Georgia's needed for him to. The Dogs just haven't needed it very much because they've had comfortable leads almost every single Saturday. But there is a fairness to the Florida fans who say the game against the Gators in Jacksonville is a different animal because Florida's owned this series and a lot of other good Georgia quarterbacks have really not fared very well here. What do you think about Fromm going into Jacksonville for the first time?
Well, I love what Kirby said. I think when you approach this topic, you have to understand that Florida is not only a good defense. I mean, they're like a perennial top 5 defense almost. When you look at where they've finished in yards per game against their opponents the last 10 years, I mean, it's like 6, 7, 3, 6, 7. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast when you're playing Florida. They're not the same defense this year, though. I mean, you're looking at, I think they're 31st ranked in yards per game for opponents. So there is an opening right there for kind of Jake Fromm and this Georgia offense to have their way. But when you bring emotion into it, when you bring toughness into it, when you bring a team in Florida that seems to be outspoken in their thoughts that Jake Fromm can't get it done and that they can go down there in Jacksonville and win this game, then it does bring out a different set of eyes to look at this game with. I think that you have to. And we talked about this last week when Alabama plays Tennessee. When you're playing one of these rivalry games, you have to look at it from a different perspective. And I think that Florida's doing that right now. And I think it's going to be tougher than most Georgia fans realize to go down there and get this win. I mean, you and I have talked about this a couple of times. Anytime you suit up against a rival, and obviously Florida sees this as a huge rival with everything they've been saying this weekend, you have to be careful that they're not playing on a completely different level than you emotionally, and that they're not trying to make their season by going to Jacksonville and knocking off this number 3 Georgia team.
Joel Anthony Dean says he's a Florida fan. Does Fromm even throw for 100 yards a game? Come on, Joel, you're better than that. Fromm's leading the SEC in yards per attempt. So if you're a Florida fan, you think, I agree with what you said. If you're a Georgia fan, you think it's going to be easy against Florida, you may be underrating what the Gators can do. But if you're a Florida fan, you don't think Fromm is a quarterback that's good enough to beat you, then you're just not paying attention. Georgia hasn't needed its quarterback, but when Fromm's been asked to play, he's played really well.
No, I agree with you. And I think that you can look at it from that perspective and say, you know what, the statistics are there to say when Fromm has needed to, that, you know, the big chunk yardage he's been able to pick up with his arm, you know, has definitely led to some of those stats. I'll play the other side of this rivalry now just for you, and I'll go on the Florida side and say, well, you know, he picked up 300 yards against Missouri. That was his best passing performance. And so I think that there is going to be a team down the stretch that's going to make Fromm win the game for him, not just throw through the air, but actually going to win the game. I don't know that that's Florida this weekend, though. I think they're going to have to play extremely well up front with their defensive front, pressure the passer, get past this running game for Georgia if they're going to expect Fromm to have to open it up in the second half. But I think there's a reason there that Florida fans are questioning what Jake Fromm is, because listen, you can talk about the yards per pass attempt, but the yards per game, I mean, I'm not sure what he's throwing for right now. I think he's still sitting there at like number 11 or 10 in terms of SEC quarterbacks.
You know what that's about. I mean,
well, absolutely.
The teams with the most yards per game are teams like Missouri and Ole Miss are not winning very much.
Yes, and Shea Patterson was leading quarterbacks. I'm just saying in terms of yards per game, I mean, I think you can look at Jalen Hurts and you can look at where Jake Fromm are, and I think it's pretty simple.
So here's what I will say about the Florida side of things against Georgia on Saturday. I do think the Florida defensive line is good enough to put the ball in the hands of Jake Fromm on Saturday. Now, eventually the Georgia offensive line and running game may wear Florida down enough that Georgia's successful in running the ball in the second half. That may happen. But the Florida defensive line is good enough to hang around for a while to force Fromm to make some throws in the first half, to force him to maybe even play in a close game for one of the few times this season. That's the one area where I think that Florida still measures up as a top-flight SEC team. Most of the other units on this Florida team right now, I don't believe are top flight by SEC caliber. But that defensive front, with the depth they have there, I will put Florida in that group.
Well, and it's also about how far Georgia's offensive line has come. I think when you put on the film and you look at it side by side from what Georgia was doing last year offensively against Florida, as opposed to what they're doing this year offensively, there's such a lack of penetration that defensive lines from other schools have been able to get against Georgia's offensive front. They're getting their head across the bow of some of these defensive linemen and not allowing these players to get into the backfield. That was been the problem the entire time under Mark Richt, was there was players slicing through, getting penetration in the backfield, making the running backs make their cut 3 and 4 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Hasn't been the case this year. Georgia's offensive line has been very good about getting across the head of some of these defenders, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest things to watch play out when these two teams match up.
Interesting comment from Maurice Carter, who says, trust me, not one of the Georgia football players thinks this win is going to be easy or going to be given to them. They are focused and ready, waiting to prove the Gators wrong. And it is kind of funny. I mean, it is such a weird dynamic in the SEC in that if you're an outside observer, it looks like Georgia's got everything going for it in this game because it's number 3 team in the country. It's essentially won all of its games by easy, comfortable margins with the exception of the road win at Notre Dame. And yet there is that element of confidence that Florida shows. Chauncey Gardner showed it there. Hammond, the wide receiver, showed it with what he said a little earlier. There is that element of Florida that still believes itself in this game, even though it's just 3-3 on the season and really a far cry from its best teams of the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Jim McElwain, I think that's the attitude you go into these meetings with. You heard, we heard from Kirby Smart yesterday or at least through interviews where, these players are saying, hey, Kirby Smart asked us to stand up if you had beaten Florida. So
Yeah.
I think Kirby's attacking it from that side. I wouldn't be shocked if Jim McElwain's going the other way, saying, you know what, these guys are coming in here, they're third ranked, they're feeling good right now, but you know what, we're Florida, and that's how we take the field, and Florida always beats Georgia, and I would not be shocked if that's how Jim McElwain's approaching the game.
Let me move on here to item number 7 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. Neither Alabama nor LSU play on Saturday. They'll tangle in primetime next week, but it's a look-ahead line from Brett McMurphy, sort of referencing the Westgate Sportsbook in Las Vegas here that kind of got my attention before the show. He kind of gave you a few of these point spreads. What to let you know is that right now, this is a little bit hard to read, so I will read it to you, but in the midst of all this gobbledygook of numbers, he indicates that according to the Westgate, Alabama is a 24-point favorite against LSU next Saturday. Are you surprised by that big of a number for Alabama against LSU?
Well, I'm not surprised that that's what the books are putting it. I think at 24, my money will probably be on LSU to cover that spread. I was in Baton Rouge last year for the 10-0 game for an Alabama team that was very good and an LSU team that was good. I think LSU is hitting their stride right now under Ed Orgeron. I think that Matt Canada's message about his offensive philosophy is finally getting through, and now he's got the players on the field to be able to pull it off. So I think 24 is a little bit big. I think that when you start to measure up these teams, it's going to be a lot to ask Alabama right now because, listen, for LSU, for everything they've done bad this year, when you look at their defense, still very good. I mean, I think they're second in the conference right now with 7 interceptions, maybe first in the conference in terms of sacks next to Texas A&M. They've done some good things with their defensive front, so I think they're getting back to the LSU team of old.
Let me make a quick comparison for you then. You got the Auburn game looming at the end of the season. We don't, at least I don't know right now what the point spread in that game is in terms of the look-ahead line. There may be something out there somewhere, but LSU, at least if we take McMurphy at his word, according to the Las Vegas Sportsbook, Alabama big favorite over LSU. Which of those two SEC West teams would you expect to give a tougher game to Alabama? Right now, I think the public is probably leaning the direction of LSU because LSU just beat Auburn. Is that the team, though, better equipped to give a close game to Alabama?
Well, I think they both bring up their own set of circumstances when you approach the game. I think LSU's defensive front probably scares you a little bit more, although Auburn has a ton of talent defensively. I think you worry as an Alabama fan about Alabama's offense against LSU's defense. It's always been the nature of the beast because they play that same style. They play that ability to really match up along the defensive line against your offensive front. I think that when you flip the page and you go to the Auburn game, I think that Alabama fans worry about Auburn's offense against Alabama's defense. I think that really both of those teams kind of stretch you on both sides of the ball. And that's where you have to look at those games. It's going to be up to Alabama's offense to kind of win the game against LSU, and it's going to be up to their defense to stop Gus Malzahn and Chip Lindsey's offense.
Let me hit a few of these comments. Steve Weaver says Vegas knows, referencing the big point spread in favor of Alabama. Cliff Nelson says, I'll bet the house and take those points. Cliff obviously loving his LSU team right now, given the way they played as of late. Ruben Leggett says the LSU game is going to be a tougher game. Casey Humble, an LSU fan, says not surprised by the big point spread. So kind of on and on you go here. Corey Andrews reminding us that Auburn's first in sacks. Listen, here's an example of me not turning my back on Auburn, my pick from the beginning of the season. Right now, Auburn's probably not as good as I thought they would be. I'll certainly admit that. But in terms of being equipped and built to challenge Alabama, I still like the teams that play different from Alabama to kind of give Alabama the better game. LSU, even with Matt Canada working the offense and Ed Orgeron, the new head coach, this is still a team to me that tries to be a carbon copy of Alabama too much. It ends up being kind of a lower calories, sugar-free version of what Alabama brings to the table, kind of a poor substitute for the real thing. I mean, last year you look at the 10-0 game. Some people say, hey, it was a close margin. The truth is, I watched that game. I didn't think LSU had any chance to win that game.
Yeah,
I mean, the close margin did not indicate just how big the gap was between Alabama and LSU. So for my money, if Alabama loses an SEC West game this year, it is still way more likely to be Auburn than LSU.
Well, I think when you look at LSU's team this year, they are so much different, in my mind, offensively than they were last year because you've brought in Matt Canada. I mean, their pre-snap motions, the thing they're doing to get Danny Etling kind of rolling out of the pocket, and also it's a different offensive line, 3 true freshmen. So I think Matt Canada is trying to mask some of the problems they have up front by moving Danny Etling around. But you mentioned it. I think when you looked at the game last year, it's very hard to out-Alabama. When you talk about Darius Geis and Leonard Fournette running at this defense for the last few years, it's going to be very tough. But I think it is a different LSU offense right now. And I really think that the message from Matt Canada is starting to really seek into these guys, and they're starting to understand what he's trying to do philosophically.
Shalika Kennedy Johnson brings up a good point. LSU wins a couple games. Now all of a sudden the game's going to be tough for Alabama. Ha, 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 ha. I do think this is an example of that for LSU. We are way too recency biased when it comes to LSU, overrating. Now, the wins they got against Florida on the road, against Auburn, those are impressive wins, especially for Auburn, who had a lot to play for in Death Valley a couple weeks ago. But this notion that a couple of weeks means the entire story's changed for LSU, what was true in the loss to Troy is still true now, even after the wins. It's just a mixture of all of that. I do think that Shalika's right in the comment section to reference there is a little too much of a roller coaster ride of public opinion when it comes to LSU. I think that's a good point.
Well, and I tend to agree with that, but I do think there is a notion where teams do get better as the year goes on. I mean, don't forget, these teams are practicing 5 days a week, too. I mean, they're showing at the facility, they're watching film, they're understanding what they did wrong, and they have good coaches. We mentioned before the year started, these might be two of the best coordinators in the SEC when you match them up next to each other with Dave Aranda and Matt Canada. So it's not like this coaching staff can't coach. I mean, they're showing up, watching film, making these guys understand what they're doing wrong. And I think there is a tendency for some of these better schools with better players to get better as the season rolls on. So I don't want to sit there and say, hey, a month ago they lost to Troy, so they're definitely going to lose to Alabama. That's just not how it works a lot of times in college football.
By the way, in the comment section as well, Trey Jackson says Auburn's going to be ready.
Well,
he's looking forward to that
Can
game.
we bring that back up and just talk about that for a second right
What's
now? Can
that?
we bring back up the graphic from the Twitter graphic?
Yeah, let me see the Brett McMurphy tweet one more time.
Because I think it's interesting to look at that Auburn-Georgia game right down at the bottom and see that Auburn is actually favored against Georgia right now. That makes me
3-point number according to the Las Vegas Superbook.
Auburn -3 against Georgia at home to me. When you line it up next to Alabama at 10.5-point favorite against Auburn, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And that's why I kind of question where the LSU line is at with 24, and the fact that you have Auburn ahead of Georgia. That to me says that Vegas really doesn't know what's going to happen, and they're going to give Auburn 3 points because they're the home team.
Well, here's the other thing, too. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds and the gambling stuff, but these look-ahead lines are usually low-limit action.
Right.
In other words, you can't go bet $1 million on Georgia as a 3-point underdog. They're not taking that bet. When you actually get to the week of the game, when bigger bets are accepted, all of a sudden you see in a lot of cases a very different line. Yeah. So maybe the Auburn-Georgia line moves then in a way that it hasn't moved so far. But I think it's also an example of, you got to go back to the beginning of the season on both Auburn and Georgia as well. Just because Georgia's been blowing teams out as of late, you got to still factor in some of what people thought about Georgia at the beginning of the season. Yeah. And for Auburn, who most people thought was going to be a pretty good team at the beginning of the year, you can't completely run away from all that just because they lost to LSU the other day.
Well, and that's what also when you add that in, I mean, that just adds another level to my argument when you look at the Alabama-LSU line and sit there and say, Alabama at -24. Can you have imagined that happening when the season opened? I don't think anybody would have put LSU as a 24-point underdog to Alabama. I still don't think it should be that line right now. So there are a couple questionable ones in there for me when you look at the rest of the season, the remainder of the schedule.
It's AT&T SEC Country Live. AT&T, a proud sponsor of SEC Country Live. AT&T, entertainment your way. That's Mike Johnson. I'm Brandon Adams, and we'll invite you to make the switch to AT&T Wireless and DirecTV. They'll help you stay connected all season long. Let's move on. Look at item number 8 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. And we talked a moment ago about the Kentucky game against Tennessee on Saturday and everything that's at stake potentially for the Vols and maybe even for Mark Stoops and Kentucky as well. But one of the veteran players for Tennessee who wants to make sure he's getting the best from his teammates is running back John Kelly, who saw his quarterback Jerry Garantano get absolutely blasted a lot last week against Alabama, including that one shot near the end of the first half when they, for whatever reason, decided they were going for a Hail Mary, and Garantano just got just blasted by the Alabama defense. Kelly didn't like what he saw, and this week he challenged some of his teammates on the Tennessee offense to do a better job of protecting Garantano. I thought this was a really insightful quote from a guy who sounds like a pretty smart young man. Here's Tennessee running back John Kelly.
He's a soldier out there. He is, and we definitely, as a whole on offense, got to make sure that we take away from the hits that he's taking. That's something that I addressed after practice today with the offensive line and the running backs, was just that we can't allow that to happen anymore. And we got to do a better job of making sure that we protect him, and when he's down, we got to make sure we're rushing to go get him up.
How much do you love that from Kelly? I got to tell you, Kelly's not a guy that, other than his profile as a player on the field, that I know a whole lot about. Don't know his background, but when you hear him talk right there as the voice of a leader, and Mike Griffith's got the whole video for you at SECCountry.com. You can check it out. He's asked some follow-up questions, and this is not something that he does all the time. Something that Kelly felt like he needed to do right now because he didn't like what he saw from some of his players and how they protected Garantano. And I love the idea at the end about, and when he gets knocked down, let's rush over there quickly and help him up. Yeah. Body language matters for a football team, and Kelly seems to understand that.
Yeah, I think he definitely had a lot of good things to say. I like that him kind of taking that little bit of leadership, because we mentioned this at the first of the year when we talked about leadership, when we talked about developing leaders. First thing you have to be is a good football player. You have to be one of the better football players.
That's so true.
It's so true because you can be the leader all you want to, but guess what? You're the third string running back coming there and talking to the offensive line saying you need to help the quarterback up. Message is going to be lost.
Yeah, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because you're a baseball fan. You know this. And for those of you watching right now who are baseball fans, sometimes in baseball you see the backup catcher who's like 40 years old.
Yes.
That's your clubhouse leader.
Yeah.
He's a veteran. He's sort of seen everything. But in football, you got to be good to be a leader. Nobody listens to a bench warmer.
No.
They just don't.
And it's tough to happen because you don't have older players in the college football locker room. You have to have that thing. And I think that John Kelly does have to be careful when he talks about this because Lord knows you know me. I think you have to be careful in not putting the offensive line in the crosshairs here because that offensive line, look, you can look around that Tennessee team. Tell me what group has been playing well.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to signal out one guy and say, well, we're not protecting the quarterback, well, guess what? Quarterback hasn't played that good. Wide receivers aren't getting open. John Kelly's really the only good thing happening with this football team. So I think that his message went a good direction. It's not, hey, let's block better or, hey, we need to be better on first down. It's say, hey, let's do the easy things. Let's help the quarterback up. Let's make sure we're rushing to kind of his side in some of these difficult games and making sure he's not getting pressured more than he needs to.
Diedrich Frazier says he's more of a leader, talking about John Kelly, than Butch Jones is. And I think there's an element of that that's true, that if more of Tennessee's players sounded like Kelly there, that Jones might actually be a coach in a little bit better standing. But I want to go back to what you said a moment ago. When you say, hey, you got to be careful about what you say about the offensive line. Are you talking about just public remarks, or are you talking about privately too? I mean, if an offensive line's not getting it done, is it okay for John Kelly in practice to say, hey, I need more from y'all from what I'm getting, or is that a no-no as well?
Well, it's definitely okay for John Kelly. Like I said, he's the leader. He's the guy who is probably your best player on your team right now, aside from some of the guys defensively. But like I said, you have to be careful how you approach that subject. You're going to have guys that are injured up front for this Tennessee offensive line. And guess what? These are the guys that are your bread and butter. They're the ones that are blocking for him right now, that are allowing him to get the yardage, or allowing him to be good. So it's a difficult situation. I think you have to approach it in a different manner than a lot of people think they would. But going back to the comment about Butch Jones, I have to agree there. Because, listen, I got to tell the story. I used to get chewed out more as an offensive lineman for not helping the quarterback up or not celebrating a touchdown during practice than almost for missing a block. I mean, it was like, if you're not rushing in the end zone to jump on your running back, or you're not helping your quarterback up off the turf, then you're wrong. And I think that's kind of where you see kind of the differences between Butch Jones sometimes. Why is this the running backs having to come out and say this? Why is the offensive line coach or Butch Jones not have already addressed this at some point?
Body language matters for a football team. This is an example of good body language, in this case, actual verbal language. We've seen too much bad of that from Tennessee, whether it be the fight allegedly between Shai Tuttle and Nigel Warrior, or the fight between Trey Smith and whoever it was that was kicking him in the face. I mean, you've had all this bad stuff going on at Tennessee. Golden flipping the birds. It's kind of nice to see Tennessee doing what it's supposed to do. I'm no Vols fan, but John Kelly earned a fan in me here today. All right, let me move on and talk about item number 9 on our AT&T SEC Country Life First and 10 list. Now, we opened the show by talking about some questions being raised about Jim McElwain's claim that he, his family, and some of his Florida players have received death threats. Mike Bianchi's written a column about this, the Orlando Sentinel, questioning the veracity of McElwain's claims. And Matt Hayes, most recently of the Sporting News, now I guess with Saturday Down South, has also written something pretty pointed here about what McElwain said, and you get the impression that Hayes doesn't believe it. He writes, I'm actually shocked Florida hasn't already fired McElwain. If you can't trust the man you're paying nearly $5 million a year to run your football program, it's time to move on to someone else. Here's the irony of this bizarre ordeal. Whether or not McElwain wants to leave, he might have just given Florida the ammunition to make it happen and not pay a $12 million buyout. So here's Hayes, the guy that's covered college football for a long time, suggesting that what McElwain said, if proven to be false, would be grounds for being fired with cause. Is that really how quickly this is potentially escalating for McElwain? Because that's surprising.
Well, I don't think that you can go that route. And here's why. Because how can you prove that somebody made a death threat to you, or how can you prove that somebody didn't make a death threat to you? I mean, like I said, this could have been any number of ways that he's getting threatened. All Jim McElwain has to do, you don't owe me $12 million? Well, you know what? I was walking down the tunnel and one of the Florida fans said, I hope you die. And there it is. I mean, that's all you can prove, and you can't prove it never happened. And so I think that you're careful if you're Florida and how you address this. I think that obviously things haven't turned out the way they wanted to for McElwain this year in this team. But we've talked about it. I mean, how many crazy things has this Florida team dealt with? The 10 suspensions, the injuries, the hurricane games they've had to deal with. Jim McElwain, for my money, has actually done a decent job. That's why I don't think I come down as hard as him as I do some of the other coaches around the SECs, because he's dealt with so many other circumstances that most programs haven't. And so I think when you talk about death threats and you talk about possible buyouts, just be careful with what you're doing right here. If I was Jim McElwain, I do think you have to approach next year with a little bit different philosophy. I think that maybe you remove yourself from Doug Nussmeier, who has not proven to be a good coordinator. Maybe you bring in somebody that offensively can challenge some of your principles and some of your ideals of how to run an offense. Maybe you bring in a spread coordinator, and maybe you can mix some of that in along with your Wildcat that you're using right now. Jim McElwain has to make changes, but I'm not down on him really hard right now about what's going on this year because it's hard to judge a guy who's really playing without 15 to 20 players from his roster right now.
Yeah, but here's the one thing that I think that you're maybe not giving enough credence to, and that is the potential damage to Florida if there isn't specific evidence to back up what McElwain's saying. If you're exaggerating what you described, a guy as you're walking up the field saying, "I hope you die," and you kind of glorify that or intensify that by taking it to a press conference, then you've made things worse for Florida after you're long gone. You have sort of labeled Florida as the program where the death threats happen. So from that standpoint, this is why Florida, I think, is, in as much of a way as it can, defending itself from what McElwain said here, because Florida as a program does want to be the place with the fan base that hopes the players die.
Yeah, and it stinks too, and I think that's the reason you've seen Jim McElwain kind of back up from some of his comments and not offer any specifics in terms of what he's telling the SID or the administration at Florida or what he's saying in these press conferences from now on. Probably the last time you hear him mention it. He'll probably kind of squash a lot of these rumors. If I had to guess, coming into the pressers today and for the rest of the week, he'll probably squash a lot of these. And I think you do have to be careful because Jim McElwain's still part of this brand. This is a damage to his reputation as much as it is Florida. If he's a coach that's getting death threats, you're going to be, the next program that hires him is going to say, we hired the coach that got death threats at one of the best programs in the country at Florida. So I understand what that is, and I understand how Florida fans would kind of take that if he, possibly is lying. I don't think he's lying though. I just think that he understands that you need to kind of brush this under the rug and maybe move on for it because it is a black eye on the program right now.
Logan Westerman, our final comment on this, says McElwain's the problem at Florida. He's such a crybaby. How many excuses can one man make for building an undisciplined program? The last part of that I'm actually going to defend McElwain on. He actually kind of and we talked about this last week, he sort of sidestepped an opportunity to use excuses about his injuries and his suspensions. I mean, that's a lot of guys to lose off one roster. Is McElwain guilty of dramatizing this? Maybe so. But in terms of sort of building in a lot of excuses, he's actually done a pretty good job of not taking some of the ones that might have been available to him this year.
Yeah, when he stepped to the podium a couple of weeks ago, and we showed it on this show, I mean, I thought he answered most of the questions head on. He just said, just flat out, it's not good enough.
Yeah.
Florida expects more, I expect more. And we're going to coach harder and we're going to get it corrected. And I think that he has done a good job of not using, the suspensions and the injuries as a crutch. Because, I mean, that would be easy to use. I mean, we mentioned it. Any week that they've played recently, 15 to 20 players they've been without from their starting lineup when they were going into fall practice. And so he can definitely go that route. Jim McElwain's probably earned the right to go that route, just hasn't done it. So I don't want fans to think he has.
All right, let me do item number 10 on our AT&T SEC Country Live First and 10 list. I thought that Reese Davis, the college football broadcaster from ESPN, had a recent tweet that I thought was pretty interesting, and it kind of fits into a narrative that's been going on in the SEC here about the strange pecking order after you have Ole Miss blow out LSU then blow out or beat Auburn, and LSU's kind of been on a roll ever since then. Like, what's the pecking order of these teams supposed to be? Well, Reese Davis at least weighed in on that on Twitter when he said that for him right now, he's actually got Mississippi State ahead of LSU in the top 25. LSU unranked because Mississippi State had a head-to-head win in a blowout. That's the edge, although he does acknowledge that LSU is a different team when those two played earlier in the year. That last part of it, I don't know that I agree with. I mean, this notion that they're a different team, well, that's the game they lost, and the other games they won, that's the only real difference is the outcome in the final score. I actually don't have a problem with Reese Davis saying whatever credit you want to give LSU, you got to give Mississippi State some credit as well because it beat LSU.
I agree with him. I think that when you start to line things up, you probably have to keep Oklahoma ahead of Ohio State in some of your polls because they, head up. That's what happened on the field. Same thing goes for Mississippi State and LSU. I do think LSU is a different team than what played Mississippi State. And to me, one of the biggest question marks, and we've talked about this a ton on the show, what was Dave Aranda doing defensively against Mississippi State? I had a lot less issues with what they are now in terms of who's getting healthy or not. In terms of what they did schematically, it was absolutely terrible. So I do think they're a better team. I think they probably learned from that game and what they did on defense. Probably have improved a little bit, but it still stands that Mississippi State beat this team by. It wasn't a close victory. If it was a 10-point, you'd say, oh, there's a little bit of difference here. Mississippi State found a wrinkle. They were able to return a touchdown, whatever. You can make that argument. 30 points or 35 points or whatever the spread differential was against these two teams in that game, you can't apologize for that. That game got out of hand.
Eddie Joseph Leverett says head-to-head should matter. And, Eddie, I agree with that. Now, I don't think that head-to-head should be the only thing that matters.
It shouldn't be the be-all, end-all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way for a team to separate itself from another, even if it lost that that team head-to-head, and for LSU, an example of that was being an Auburn team that blew out Mississippi State. So LSU's got some ammunition in this discussion as well, but you can't completely disregard head-to-head because one team seems hotter now.
Like I said, if this was 7 points, 10 points, you say, oh, special teams played a factor. If they kick the field goal at the end to win the game, then I can see how you might mix that up. But if you're looking at this game and understanding this was not a close game. I mean, not by any stretch of the imagination was LSU in this game in the second half. I mean, this was an absolute drumming from Mississippi State, and you have to wear that if you're LSU. You have to understand that, hey, that might affect where we're at the end of the year.
All right, coming up in just a moment, something that doesn't normally happen here on AT&T SEC Country Live. I'm actually going to be featured prominently in the Champion of Life.
It's so good.
We'll do that coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, AT&T, as I told you, proud sponsor of SEC Country Live, AT&T, entertainment your way. Make the switch to AT&T Wireless DirecTV, a great way to stay connected to the college football season all season long. And speaking of AT&T, let's get ready to do our AT&T look ahead. I've been reminding you about this now for a couple of weeks, and next week, well, the day will be here, October 31st, Halloween night, a spooky, scary night for some, and maybe for some SEC teams as well when they find out where they're ranked in those first college football playoff rankings when they do come out. At one point in time, we thought we were going to have Auburn featured prominently in the top 10 along with Alabama and Georgia. Maybe not, but LSU and Auburn at least hanging around close enough to give you 4 SEC teams potentially in the mix here?
Well, I think so. I think when you talk about the top 25, I think that LSU can make a lot of noise if they keep it close against Bama or possibly pull off a win against Bama this next weekend. But I expect that those are the 4 best teams right now. I still think there's some other teams under the radar that are going to make a little bit of noise too. I mean,
a national team or an SEC team?
Well, an SEC team.
Okay.
When you look at this, I mean, you can look at possibly Texas A&M at some point, squeezing in down the road. Kentucky, if they're able to pull off a couple more wins, maybe they can sneak in at some point too. They're still
talking about American football.
Yeah, still sitting at 5-2. So
football?
I wouldn't argue with any of those teams, but I think there's definitely 4 that are going to be probably near the top 25 when it all comes said and done.
And everyone else will be eligible for Champions of Life.
That's
and speaking of the Champion of Life, we close up the show the same way each and every day here
so
on AT&T SEC Country Live. Butch Jones looks for them. We look for them as well. And I'll show you this one tweet that I got from a person who sent to me at Dog Nation Daily on Twitter, Steve Harmon, who says that I look like USC quarterback Sam Darnold. Now, USC played about as well on Saturday against Notre Dame with me as they did with Darnold. So you can kind of see the side-by-side comparison here. Do I look like Darnold? I mean, is that...
Can you give us a scowl? Can you give us like a bent-over scowl?
Let me see if I can do it. Well, first of all, I can't get that nice flowing coiffed hair like Darnold
got a
can.
good one.
What's the look here?
Can you give me one of these right here with the brows down? Give me one of these right here. Oh, that's it, man. That is so beautiful right there. I mean, if you don't agree with that, then I don't even know what to tell you. That is absolute gold. When I saw that picture, I was like, that is so perfect.
He has a birthmark like I do. I didn't notice that.
Like he's got this like bent over scowl to him. I mean, I wish we could get like a headshot of him, not an action photo, but I think it's spot on. I really do. I think it's spot on.
So what you're saying is I'm as handsome as the USC quarterback.
Well, either that or his last name should be Adams and not Darnold.
Listen, you know what?
He might be your long-lost son at some point there, B.A.
I'm not even going to go there. That's Mike Johnson. I'm Brandon Adams. We'd love to have you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. It's a great way to listen to the audio version of the show if you missed any portion of our broadcast today. And if you want to share the show with your friends on Facebook, let them know we're talking about the SEC each and every day here on AT&T SEC Country Live. And by the way, one more thing before I let you go. Nakia Hester in our comment section reminded me to make sure I say hello to the folks on YouTube. Tomorrow we got to figure out a way to do that.
Absolutely.
The truth is, I don't know how to toggle both comment sections at the same time. But between now and tomorrow, we'll figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, we sure will.
All right, so we'll do that. You can also watch the show live every day on YouTube if you prefer to do that. It is a little easier for me to keep up with the comments on Facebook, but we'll say hello to the YouTube folks tomorrow as well. See you tomorrow as well, 3 p.m. Eastern Time for another episode of AT&T SEC Country Live. Y'all have a great day.